So what I think we want to do at the moment is we're going to go through these just in the order in which they're presented in here. And we've had volunteers, perhaps use the word volunteers in quotes, okay, from the various groups to serve as spokesperson. And I think what I'd suggest we do in this particular context, and the reason I said as long as it takes, is because in some of these areas, the ideas might be more straightforward than others and what have you. So I don't want to regiment it too much. But what I would suggest in this particular stage is that since the purpose of this part is really just get a bunch of things out on the table, okay? And then the subsequent session that Alan is going to moderate will be one, I think, where effectively we can really have more audience participation and what have you in terms of really identifying things. So what I would encourage you to do as we get back to reports of the breakout groups is there some things in there that really strike your fancy in one way of, this is something we're really in a position to emphasize in one way, shape, or form. Be sure to make a note of that because there'll be an opportunity to basically bring that up in the subsequent session or just as importantly, to get it out on the website later. Okay, so with that very brief introduction, we'll first talk about the, when we're looking at grid and storage, and Dan Zimmerly is going to lead that discussion.
So I can read it. Right. I just need to read it because this is my entire records are right here. Okay. And you notice we covered up fuse, so. Okay, so our group was looking at grid and storage area, and just for a little bit of context, so that the grid in the west has a few unusual characteristics, right? So a couple of the things that are true about the grid over on the western side is it's divided up into a lot of small balancing authorities, 30-some of those. It's a fairly spread out system. There's some large mountains in the middle, sort of things have to be routed around that. But also there's some interesting bits about the underlying energy systems in this area, including things like a very diverse energy mix from coal, oil, gas, wind, and so on. And also very diverse climate regime basically from New Mexico to Montana was in the room. And on the phone earlier, we had people from North Dakota as well. So with that context in mind, what we came up with is primarily focusing on two strengths, or on the strengths and opportunities area out of the questions. And two things bubbled kind of the top of our list. The first one was this region that's represented here has a unique strength in what we would call kind of a bulk renewables integration play, right? So what we have is very large distributed renewable resources, be it large solar plants, wind resources, large hydro plants, that type of thing. So we're kind of uniquely positioned in some respects to be looking at a regional play on very high penetration renewable energy. Okay, and I'll go through a couple of the points behind that. Okay, so one of them is, in addition to that kind of geographical mix and the energy system mix, we also have some strengths in a couple of areas and some opportunities in a couple of areas related to the way we're currently set up. So in the strengths area, we have some cross-cutting technology areas which are well established in our universities and in the national labs in the region and in the companies around that we could leverage. And a few of those cross-cutting strengths are things like in the cybersecurity area, in addition to some lab strength, we also have a fair representation of aerospace companies and some other like military bases where there's a fairly deep strength in the cybersecurity area. We have a very strong atmospheric sciences presence in the region. So things like weather forecasting, which has a big impact on variable renewables. We also have a good presence in that space. We have good scale, integration, analysis capabilities at scale, and deployment capabilities at scale, both from industry, people who've actually put in large wind plants and that type of thing, from universities and from the labs in terms of bringing things out and supporting folks in the field. So with those kind of cross-cutting strengths, here's a couple of reasons to sell you on the idea of why sort of this bulk renewable, mega scale might be a good play for us. One of them is that we already have a fairly good idea of forecasting in this area, for forecasting both loads and wind and a bunch of other kind of computationally intensive aspects. We have a very unsettled grid management system in the West. Balkanized is the term I usually use for it. A bunch of small operating authorities. And so that means that as you're envisioning a grid of the future, it's both an issue and it's also an opportunity, because in this region there will probably be some development of things like power trading, markets and the like that could be engineered to fit with any new system you come up with. We have the possibility for large-scale energy storage. This is grid and storage. So part of that is things that are just related to the region, things like pumped hydro or hydropower. But there's also areas like concentrating solar power with thermal storage, like thermal salt storage, and also with evolving technology like NREL is the hydrogen supply chain lead right now. Okay, so, and there's some material science folks who are contributing in even at a more basic level into that kind of large-scale energy storage space. Okay. There's a driver behind this for what I'd call displacement. So if we move to a carbon neutral or carbon-free energy system, there are people in the coal development area and oil and gas spaces that will be impacted by that. So there's going to be an incentive for that transition and to bridge across those. And then the last is we've got this geographical diversity. So all the way from warm to cold, winter peaking, summer peaking, a lot of different areas with different climate, microclimates, and so on. Okay? So that was the one area, that's one of two areas where we felt that there was a good strength position. Okay. The second area is on what I'll loosely term microgrids, so I hate using the term microgrid because it means, well, it can mean anything to anybody, so you can all be happy. Okay. But the idea here with microgrids is trying to do the integration at the smaller scale and at these kind of locally dynamic areas. And so the first thing you have to say was, is there anybody in this region who would care about that? And what we're seeing is that there's some customer and commercial industrial development that would potentially be interested in being kind of the footprint launching points for some of this. So there's military bases, there's commercial places like, let's say, tourism areas that want a green footprint. There are people in the data center area that have large loads and are actually going into fairly rural areas, that type of thing. So there's some potential pull on the microgrids. Very different sort of pull than you'd get on the East Coast where they're trying to survive Hurricane Sandy, okay, or that type of thing. So more greening type of focus, more of a military-based type of focus, rather than sort of that grid resilience focus that you're seeing along the Gulf Coast and on the East Coast. Okay. We also have a very good physical research infrastructure for microgrids, to some extent not quite as well developed, but reasonable physical infrastructure for doing demonstration projects on both sides of this. Okay, so we have microgrid labs in about 5 different places in the region. We've got the lab at INL, which goes up to a little bit larger size. So we've got really some pretty good test beds in a laboratory. We probably could get a couple of cities involved who would be willing to try things at the next scale, and you could kind of push things maybe up to a slightly kind of a larger region scale with a little bit of work. Okay. We've got a lot of private sector and startups in this space. And I'd put the private sector into kind of 2 buckets. We've got sort of the new company type. There's grid control companies like Spire. a number of others who are in the microgrid space. There's people who are in advanced metering and some of those type of startups. But we also have a large suite of companies in the area who are in control systems, distributed control systems. Woodward Governor, a couple other names are in my head, but they popped out, okay? And then finally, these two could fly together, right? So in a proposal type environment, the cross-cutting elements, the strengths that we have in various parts of our research community and our industrial community are things that could contribute into parts on both sides of this equation. So there's some overlap, and there's also some unique areas we could go after on both of those sides. So I haven't seen any really cringing from my group out there. Okay, so I figure I didn't mangle it too badly. And then if there's any questions, do we have questions now, or you just want to pass it on?
I think at this stage more in the context of clarification.
Clarification questions, okay. Good. Boy, I must have been good. Okay.
I'm just going to comment on one thing. You said that you felt that things were more green and resilient needs out here.
Yep.
But I might point out that we're all in the mountains and we all anticipate earthquakes.
We all,
anticipate earthquakes coming to our area.
oh, really?
So we could well end up just as troubled as somebody with Hurricane Sandy.
Okay, that's interesting. Usually what I hear about mountains is the fire, fire problems, right? Knocking out grid systems.
You've got fires knocking out grids and you've
Yep.
got earthquakes knocking out grids.
Yeah.
And when an earthquake knocks out a grid, it's for a long time.
Yep, good point.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, we'll next hear from the group that focused on food, energy, water, and I understand that Jeff Muse and Ken Carlson are going to be kind of co-spokesperson for that group.
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'll kick it over to the session leaders a few minutes into it. Organizations that were involved in our session included federal entities. We had the Office of Indian Energy, EPA, both involved, the private sector, AECOM, several universities, South Dakota, Montana, Utah, Colorado. We had a national laboratory, NGOs, so a whole host of organizations involved in the discussion. Some of the underlying sort of themes or thoughts about the region and how it relates to food, energy, and water. A lot of tribal lands, public lands, military bases, a growing population, sort of tension between rural and urban population growth in the urban areas, and then the fact that there was sort of extremes in food, energy, and water sort of production, if you will, and use throughout the entire region. I think the general thought was that we needed to think about food, energy, and water from a systems approach. One thought that sort of popped to mind was some sort of a systems level model that not only included those three topics, but all the externalities that go along with them, such as habitat and wildlife, social and policy issues, financial implications, the unintended consequences of making systems more efficient in some cases, other ecosystems and governance systems. And so the general context was there was sort of a need to look at food, energy, and water beyond just the technology, and look at things like life cycle, cost analysis, finding a balance between, and looking at this from a holistic perspective, and sort of develop a set of underlying organizing principles before sort of marching off to do technology development. So I think that's sort of one theme that sort of popped out of the session. I think it was also recognized that the region has a very rich history of an abundance of energy production, food production, constrained by water, and it has historical basis for all three of these things combined together, and therefore it was a very unique region for this particular topic, and we thought it was a very good topic for this region to focus on. I think we identified a number of sort of activities that were ongoing, and I'm going to let Ken sort of summarize some of those. But before I do that, I would just say that I think that the thought was that there is a number of unmet needs, for example, in the agricultural systems. where there could be a number of market pulls. An example of that was a new milling operation, $4 billion milling operation. And what are ways that we can sort of not just sort of do a technology push, but market pull in the system as it goes forward? A couple of other points that were made I thought was interesting. There was an Infuse program. I think it's funded by USDA that we felt like was a good model, a potential model for some of the technology development areas. I think the ARPA-E techno-economic process that projects go through before they're funded was one that we thought would be an interesting add to this particular area. And from a commercial deployment perspective, finding ways to incent these demonstrations, pilots, test beds that scale the efforts and de-risk the programs for the market pull to sort of take hold. I think those were all things that were very sort of the themes that came out of the session. So Ken, I want to turn it over to you and you can maybe talk a bit more specifics about some of the activities and some of your thoughts in general.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We had a call last week with that was open to all the states, and so we had some preliminary feedback, and three of the things that came out of that were that there is a lot of interest in biofuels throughout the region. Related to that is the water constraints that Jeff talked about, and rather than food, maybe thinking about it as agriculture, which everybody has, and that can account for 80% of the withdrawal of water in each of the states that are in the region. And there's energy obviously required for that. So irrigation was key. Smart irrigation was there are multiple projects going on within the region. And the last one was some sort of effort towards oil and gas produced water, which is a food energy water. So there are several projects in this area. One of the things we're doing at CSU is looking at produced water for irrigating biofuels. We thought Infuse, which Jeff, it's actually a NSF program, Innovation at the Nexus of Food Energy Water Systems. And one of the reasons we thought that was a pretty good model was that they force you to look at multidisciplinary approaches to problems. We actually had a little diagram. Well, it's right here, right? Did you go through this? No. Okay, so we put technology in the middle because we don't think DOE will fund anything that doesn't have technology out in front. That's a question for Brian, though. I will formulate it later. But we would like to think that this area, maybe more so than the other three sessions, is more of it has to have a system approach. I mean, the fact that we're already looking at food, energy, water technologies, but bringing in social sciences, which we think is key, economics, of course, policy, and ecosystems. So the question for Lynn Orr, but I think he's left, right? So I'll pose the question to Brian to follow up. Brian, is DOE interested in system work for this partnership? You don't have to answer, but we don't know. Yeah, a lot we don't know. But I mean, we think it's critical because we think that what they want commercialization, right? And so when you throw in social barriers, economic barriers, and policy barriers, we know in the world of water that those are key. And I think they're key in every technology, you could argue. So we think research has to be done and then environmental or ecosystem concerns. So that's sort of how we approach the whole thing, and I think everybody thought these were regional issues. Zahi, where are you?
Here. I think one topic to add is the scale of operation and the economy of scale. And when you go, not everything is at large scale. I think people in the first panel here today talked about large scale, and in large scale it's very easy to recover energy, it's very easy to recover minerals and other materials and nutrients. At a small scale where you have small communities in our region, it's a little bit more difficult. So again, it comes back into the energy, in the water, into the food, and how to increase efficiency of systems. So.
Thanks, Adi. Any questions, burning comments?
this side.
Okay, then let's go on to the next group, which is going to be energy climate, and we'll have two spokespeople for that, Bob McGrath and Dag Numadow. Here you go, Dag.
Thank you. Whoops. Thank you, Tony. We had a very lively discussion, very good turnout. So I would like to start by just mentioning the new friends that we made in the course of this afternoon from Los Alamos National Lab, the Idaho National Lab, CU, CSM, and CU and Mines, of course, were all there. We had also representatives from NREL, University of Utah, University of Wyoming, University of North Dakota, and about half a dozen or more companies here from the foothills area. Encana was there, EERC, Noresco, Newmont, Ecomic, F3 Power. I'm not sure I can read that one, somebody Mobilization, and Sturman Industries. So more importantly than just remembering who those names are, but we thank you all, of course, for coming, is that clearly the mission innovation that the UE is starting is already very visible throughout startup industries and established industries throughout our region. That's a very promising sign. And we already decided that we will set up a bit of a website interaction. Maybe we'll do an LinkedIn. Somebody suggested that. I don't know what the final tool will be, but those of us that already met to start discussing the energy and climate collaboration issues got so excited and wrapped up in the topics we discussed that we want to maintain that dialogue, and we'll find the appropriate electronic communications medium to do so. I think we all recognize the enormous significance of what we are all doing, not just in our working group, but all of you and what Linor was talking about before. And forgive me for digressing just for a moment, but just last night I happened to be reading the next to the last issue of Science magazine. I think it is dated September 12th or 10th or something. It was a short summary, and I haven't had time to go up and look at the full article yet, with a diagram based on some of the economics modeling that the Lawrence Berkeley Lab has just released. And to me, it drove home more than anything else that I've read in many years as to the significance of what we are about to do. They were looking at the economic impact globally in response to warming, according to the two sort of commonly used scenarios, the RCP 2.5 or RCP, what the higher one is, 8. And then they were just graphically summarizing their findings with two pictures of planet Earth seen sort of at night, where the economic activity across the planet was plotted in the context of bright lights indicating high industrial and urban activity. So started with sort of what the world is today, where you see lights in all of North America and along the west coast of South America and Central America, of course, and Africa and Europe, the same thing. Then they forwarded only 50 years. And if you go that higher RCP 8.5 scenario, there would be no visible economic activity, according to their models, anywhere south of the US-Mexican border and maybe north of the southern tip of Chile or so. In Europe, Scandinavian countries did very well, apparently, but that's a question if the rest of the world doesn't do well, if that's true or not. Rest of Europe, okay, no economic activity in Africa. And it struck me as a more powerful message than just about anything else that I've read about the significance of what we are about to do. That vision of planet Earth with no economic activity 30 degrees north and south of the equator is not the future that we want to move towards. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're trying to find a mechanism. And the UE stepped up and provided this phenomenal opportunity with this Mission Innovation Partnership to allow us to really start addressing these important projects. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob too, and because he will have a other list of some of the more specific things that we will also start doing over the next several weeks and months. And again, Bob, where are you? Do you want to pick it up there? And again, I want to thank the UE, I guess Lenore has left, for taking this wonderful initiative on the Mission Innovation.
Thanks, Doug. As Doug mentioned, we had a rich and lively discussion, and thanks to all of the participants. There was a lot of great information exchange and some nice suggestions for follow-up. We recognized within our energy and climate discussion group that there's significant overlap with the food, energy, water group, and it turns out with the grid group and the renewable group. So we will have to coordinate across the breakout sessions on the follow-up. Just in quick summary, I'll mention that several people within our group brought up important issues around public policy and behavioral sciences. And there was great emphasis on the need for education, both at the K through 12 level and at the general public level and at the level of our elected officials. And so there was, we do need to give some thought to following up, and that's a mission that our universities and all of our public policy groups take seriously and have for years, but specifically on these topics, we may need to try to focus our efforts a little further. There was also some brief discussion, but a couple of important contributions around energy efficiency, and that came through as an area in need of additional attention. And I know that that's something else that transcends several of our breakout sessions, so we'll have to follow up on that. A couple of other unique themes that came through that really impressed me and gave me additional food for thought. Several folks pointed out that our objective today was to come together to talk about what is unique to our region. And there were some great insights offered, and I apologize for lack of attribution here, but my notes are extensive. All of our notes are extensive, but there were some wonderful contributions. Some of it came around recognizing that our region is rich in both fossil energy and renewable energy sources, and that made us unique in many respects around the country as a net exporter of both energy sources. Some interesting follow-up related to that had to do with implementing significant energy storage, perhaps at the gigawatt level scale, where the energy is produced. And of course, that theme resonates with our other groups that we heard, other breakout sessions and themes that were being discussed. But is it possible for us to take on the development of gigawatt level energy storage in our region? Since we have the sources that would produce that energy that needs to be stored. And then there was separate follow-up discussion and recognition around the fact that even as we generate this energy, and especially if we take on the regional enterprise of storing such energy at a significant scale, the need for expanded distribution systems is highly, highly important. So that came through as themes that we should think about. The other area that came through, and on this one, Cindy Foos put this one forward on the table, our colleagues from Utah, who's representing Utah State and Brigham Young today. So collaboration is wonderful, and our recognition to Utah for working together so effectively. But she pointed out that air quality is something else that is in particular of interest to both Denver and Salt Lake City and the surrounding areas. And it's interesting that we all, I don't mean to speak for everyone, but I think there's strong recognition within the room that climate change is important for various reasons. But as we heard from several of our leaders this morning, the governor, former Governor Ritter, from Lynn Orr, it's not clear that everyone is willing to buy on to that theme as a motivation for why we need to take action. But Cindy was pointing out that regionally, If you're in Salt Lake City under an inversion, you're suffering significant health quality problems and issues, and all of that is related back to energy generation, pollution emissions, and how to deal with that may be addressed by tapping into our extensive regional strengths around extensive climate modeling, and in particular microclimate modeling, which is an emerging theme for many of our research institutions. Finally, I'll just mention that related to all of those themes, there was a recognition that technology innovation and spin-off is important. We need to work together to drive that to commercialization, and I know that's a theme for our colleagues in Utah. They've been wonderfully successful in that regard, for our colleagues in Wyoming, and for us certainly here in the Colorado area. We've been addressing that and emphasizing that for quite a long time. So the only other thing I'll mention is that we have these summaries. It's been a great day. It's been a wonderful set of interactions and communication exchange, but we have to follow up. And so we've been already organizing some follow-up sessions on energy and climate, and there were suggestions, and I think there will be additional suggestions coming from the other breakouts groups, that we should continue to get our research teams meeting and talking with each other, and that's where a lot of the follow-up may be. We are here today in part because we are anticipating perhaps a large regional opportunity to response to DOE mission innovation opportunities, but many people pointed out that if we just get our researchers talking to each other, they will find and generate smaller opportunities to get started on, and these will be terrific building blocks for the future. So with that, thanks, and who's next? Tony? Thanks, Bob. You bet.
Comments, questions for Bob? Okay, and so we'll finish up now, certainly last but not least, with Brian Wilson, who's going to talk about renewable sources.
Thank you, Tony. Very diverse set of stakeholders, very spirited discussion. We had the normal suspects from the NREL, CU, CSU, School of Mines, but also participation from University of New Mexico, University of Nebraska, Economic Development Agency, the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado, C0, Sandia National Lab, the American Lung Association, and the Pipefitters Union. So we began our discussion with were there topics that should be considered that weren't in the main four topics. And that was actually a pretty interesting discussion. There was a significant discussion on the inclusion of recycling, efficiency, and reuse, looking at the issues of waste and utilization in manufacturing. There was a note that we really don't have specific discussion on policy and behavior. There was a discussion on, this goes back to Ken's earlier question on systems analysis. We've got these topical areas, and do we need more integrative topics like systems analysis? There was the recommendation that where does nuclear have a role? Where should it go? Is it under renewables? Is it under energy? And then there's also a discussion that perhaps we were being too broad. After putting a lot of additional topics on the table, the question was, is this too broad? Do we need to pick one or two that we can really focus on with the amount of resources that are likely to be available? We did talk about resources and opportunities, and as many noted, we're rich in both renewables across the entire region, wind, solar, biomass. However, we do need to note that the region isn't homogeneous in those resources. But we're particularly rich in intellectual resources, certainly a strong set of universities, great companies. We're rich in DOE labs with these 4 DOE national labs, but even many more non-DOE labs that really add value. So as already noted, NOAA, NIST, NCAR, USDA, Forest Service, and then a wide variety of others, including the Agricultural Extension Services. It's also noted that one of our resources is the strong entrepreneurial culture along the Front Range. It was noted that this region really could evolve into the Silicon Valley of renewable energy. We have the advantages that there's also, we've worked through at least some of the social dynamics around collaboration through the Colorado Energy Research Collaboratory that serves at least as a bit of a basis for regional centers. But it was noted that we would benefit from having innovation theorists at the table. On the commercialization side, there was a discussion around the differences in approach on utilities versus co-ops. Co-ops, in many ways are really interested in retail, but have lack some of the capacity for the analysis around the technology and commercialization. It was noted that much of the research coming out of the labs, whether they're national labs or universities, tend to be just out of reach of commercialization in terms of, so it felt that perhaps we need a translational R&D to get the technologies ready for productionization. There's really an interesting idea around the idea of a market pull through creation of an innovation standard. So in the same way that many states required a certain amount of energy to come from renewables or in biofuels, certain would be from the more expensive next generation biofuels, that perhaps there should be an innovation standard for innovation certified new technologies that would be somewhat higher cost, but would help to bridge the gap to commercialization. There's discussion, a lot of discussion around policy, the need to create technology pull instead of push. It was noted that there's we could, to the extent that we can begin to predict the on-ramps or the needs of when new technology comes online would be useful. There was a discussion around standardization on requirements. It's noted that many states have renewable energy standards. Department of Defense has a requirement around keeping the country safe. It would be perhaps useful if we could define a set of requirements for a regional center. Is it to enable enable us to move to a certain percentage of decarbonization? There can be discussion around what those requirements are, but it's felt that we should be building a center around a regional set of requirements that we would look at. We also note that can be. It's not necessarily legally binding, but it is something that would help us to align. We did talk about governance and some of the questions around to what degree are we looking at fundamental science versus integration versus policy. There was a discussion that, is this in some ways like almost a regional RPE that's able to define requirements for the region. There are questions on whether this is, whether DOE will really be focusing on innovation program or whether this looks more like a regional program office. There was a lot of talk on models around organization. Finally, I think there was a discussion that we really need to look at simplifying our message. It was noted that when you take a campaign like Stop Smoking, it's very easy to understand what that means. And so is there some similar standard we can get to for on the energy side? Finally, we did a quick lightning round, a couple things that didn't really fit in other places. This question on modeling versus systems analysis. We noted that we would mention the words photosynthesis, that there's a need for that in this final discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, well, as you might have guessed, Alan Rudolph drew the short straw. And so he has a dubious distinction of now effectively getting us and wrapping things up. And more importantly, I think, beginning to generate the type of momentum in terms of moving forward, as several of you has alluded to. So.
Is this on? Yeah. Hi. First of all, I assure you I don't have an hour of summary comments, so assuage any fears that you have that I stand between you and the reception. But I think it's useful just to take the time to do an important sort of summarization of today. And first of all, I also want to just extend the thanks for the people who helped organize this, both the RACI folks, but especially Maury Doby and Karen Murphy. If you'd join me in just thanking them for we started putting this together about 6 weeks ago, and all of us sat around various phone calls wondering what the room would look like. But the energy of today that we got out of it, and I think the feedback we got out of it, is really going to propel us with a lot of momentum. And that's really a tribute to your persistence and your passion for the topics that we've covered today. So thank you for that. I want to briefly let me tell you what I'm going to do up here just for a few more minutes. Briefly recap some of the day's highlights and themes. I'll do that very briefly. And then briefly talk about next steps. Notice I've used the word briefly 3 times. So I want to give you a sense of what's next, because I think it's important, the conversation we've had today, but as important is what are we going to do? What are we going to do next? And we intend to keep up the momentum. And you heard, I think, some of the passions, not just for the opportunity in front of us. Clearly, as DOE moves forward in thinking about mission innovation, we stand ready to respond. But I think the great thing about these events is bringing the disciplines together, the conversations, the meetings that happen in the hallways and in the breakout rooms, and exploiting those relationships further as we should, not only for mission innovation, but what our passions will bring us. So this collaborative theme of today and bringing us together, we certainly want to take the advantage of and build the momentum. And then I will open the floor for any final comments or suggestions you have for next steps, and then we'll adjourn. So that's really what my intention is. I want to start out. I mean, it was great to have Bill Ritter here. He's he's really an icon in the field and on the national stage, and we're so glad to have him here in the region and what he's done for Colorado. Bill started us out with charging us with questions, and I thought it was worthwhile to repeat those because I think they really do represent the themes of today. I mean, I think we really followed that script pretty well, not to say we filled it in entirely. But he challenged us in 4 or 5 questions in deploying technology. How do we get to utilization, working together to shorten the gap? We heard a lot about deployment today, and in fact, some of the breakout sessions that we heard in the report back, some of the unique attributes we have in the region with regard to deploying technology at scale. How do we create pathways for pilots to flourish? How do we create better connections from unmet needs from utilities and industry? I want to pause here because I think that first panel was a great opportunity both to have Martin sort of make the point about how innovation still needs to be at the table for unmet needs. But we had industry here and utilities here, and the point was made that we have a lot of technology, and how do we engage with industry in even more powerful ways? And I want to come back to that point in a minute. But I thought that first panel and that question about making better connections with industry and utilities is really a theme we're thinking hard about, not only here in Colorado, but I think regionally, and I think that's a big momentum push behind mission innovation. How do we address operational business models or models to support revenue generation within the future operations that embrace the future of renewables? And again, that panel, I think, set the stage early with Bill about those opportunities and what we had in terms of new opportunities here in terms of diversifying and broadening, if you will, the landscape so renewables can be more easily integratable. The last piece, though, was interesting. He brought it up. I know it's a passion of Bill's if you read his book, and you know he's been involved with the more recent catalytic papal writings on environment and climate science, is the social justice of innovation and renewable. We had great participation from some diverse groups here today, and I think that was important. I think this is really something we're going to need to work on more. I mean, there's a lot of discussion both in higher ed and industry around diversity. Diversity is a key element of building innovation practices early on. And I think this is a challenge for us, but you know, this affordability and accessibility of energy, even with our socioeconomic stratification here in the U.S., is something that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to. It also starts to touch upon that area I think you heard as one of the themes here. It's about social sciences and behavior. I mean, I think for many of us in the room, and I'd raise my hand as being sort of on the research side, technology side, this is a newer lens of looking through the real power of what it's going to take to see adoption and change in our society. And so this social culture and behavioral issues, you know, will keep coming up, whether it's deploying technology now or how do we integrate diverse voices in the room with regard to making sure that the social justices of innovative practices as we think about integrated energy systems and their applications are attended to. You know, and I think what was really nice about the feedback we heard from the breakouts, and I think really important for us as we think about preparing ourselves for this mission innovation opportunity, is what is our regional competitive advantage? And I think we've done a good job at sort of bringing out some of those. One of the things I didn't hear, and I know Governor Hickenlooper didn't talk about it today, but we have a distinct generational advantage in this region. We're the #1 site of millennials for the United States, and so we think often about diversity in different ways, but we've got a really young population, and it, you know, if you think about that with regard to attracting industry, I think one of the things industry is very interested in here is a workforce generational interest that we have. And as a competitive advantage, I think something that didn't quite come out as much as it could have, but I think we all recognize that and seek to exploit it. The governor, I think, you know, gave us a lot of spiritual remarks and useful remarks. One thing I got out of it, you know, is he talked about how innovation facilitates collaboration at scale. And I think that's a really important comment. And from his background, I think, you know, he looks at that through the lens of leveraging markets in the private sector. And again, that's something that I think regionally and thematically we're very much focused on. How do we get our industry partners at the table in a much more demonstrative way and advocating, but also participating and collaborating with us in these areas? So, you know, I think those were some of the highlights we heard from this morning, and you know, then we had some great feedbacks from the groups. I want to turn now to talking a little bit about what's ahead of us and the thinking that we've done. You know, one of the, I think, competitive advantages we do have here in anchoring in Colorado, but inviting this northern region together today is the collaboratory. It's no mistake we put that economic report that was released today in your binders, and I encourage you to read that. I mean, for somebody who just arrived in Colorado a few years back, joining this Colorado collaborative, it's really been an impressive collaboration of the 3 universities and the DOE lab and the economics, which I think is another aspect of our communication plans and talking to legislatures about economic impact. The returns from the investments that have been made there are really powerful, and I think maybe a model for us to consider in expanding. I think that's one of both governors kind of mentioned that, both one from an historical perspective, having helped start it, and one who's now in the office now. So just as you heard Lynn Orr talk about the ingredients, if you will, or constituents of a successful mission innovation application, of course, we'll pay close attention to that. I think I won't go through the list. He gave us a list of that, but one of the things you will recall that he said is that the movement of a application for mission innovation will be through the creation of a 501c3. So we've already started to take the steps to form this 501c3 and draft some bylaws, And for those in the room thinking about joining us in this effort, I think this is the next step for us. I mean, we want to share with you those bylaws. We want to inform you about the creation of this foundation in order to compete for this opportunity. But more so, I think bylaws are a way tribes come together and start to agree on things. And so, you know, we've had a lot of great discussion today, a lot of communication between new people, new folks who've come together to share passions. And now, you know, the governance of how those passions get inculcated into an organization is before us. And so this 501c3 with the bylaws that will essentially create the organizational grounding of moving ahead with an opportunity and mission innovation are in fact the next steps. And so we have already proceeded to start to draft those bylaws, and we will share those with constituencies who've come together today. The portal for the questions that we pose to you and the feedback and the outbreak rooms will be open on the website for another few days. I think September 22nd is the day we'll leave the portal open. And, you know, just as you heard one of the breakout groups say, you know, we're going to carry on with this communication. This is great, and we'd like to do the same and offer the portal for you to give us your ideas and comments that you may have so that we can continue to move forward. I think there's a very aggressive schedule for getting these reports. Part of the reason we came together so quickly 6 weeks ago was guidance from DOE to really get this meeting and report in place so we would have essentially a placeholder for this very important region. I think we were highly encouraged by DOE, and I think that's a good sign because they recognize the impact that this region can make, and so we intend to follow up, which is why we came together so quickly. So that's really the summary I had, and now I'll just offer a brief time again if there are some comments or things that haven't been said by you that you feel that you would like to say in the benefit for the group. We'll have a reception here shortly after where we can have some more conversation and small group discussion. But if there's anything for the group that you would like to continue to have some discussion on, or a question, a comment, a suggestion on the day, or a follow-up that you would like to make sure that we note, now is the window to do so. And I'll just open the floor and see if people want to have such comment or question.
I think so. I was going to mention, Alan, people have been asking if we're going to re-edit these videos and then put them back on the website. The answer is yes. In this short week, I hope to do that. And the PowerPoint from Dr. Orr.
I thought I went, was that on? Okay. I want to thank all of you. I think this has been a tremendous event and a lot of effort that went into it, and it really showed. So thank you for that. A lot of thought came out of it that's important to us. I just wanted to address the question about the system. Absolutely, we're looking at system solutions, but the Department of Energy has to fund things within the Department of Energy's mission. The thing that's unique about these partnerships is we're looking at if we get appropriated and authorized to do technology neutral and put the funds in the hands of the regional folks to make the decisions on what they need to fund in terms of technology for their region. But we would envision these partnerships working together and getting synergies for if there's an agency that's funding behavioral science in your region and it's synergistic to what you're trying to do in that partnership, you would be able to work with those so that you could take a systems approach. So that's what we're envisioning. There's a report that came out by the National Academies recently, and it was called The Power of Change. And there's a whole chapter in there on regional partnerships that I think all of you will find insightful, and it is in line with what we're thinking. So.
Thanks for those
Thanks,
comments.
Kimberly.
Yeah,
If you have
thanks,
any
Kimberly.
questions, Kimberly, are you staying around to the reception as well? Great. Others? Let me make sure I get a microphone to people because we're recording. Yeah, go ahead, Stan.
Well, it just seems like we've spent a lot of time today, and it's very important that we have some action items to come out of this. Is that on? There, now it's on. Cindy First, University of Utah. We've spent a lot of time today discussing what we'd like to do, so it's really important that we not leave here without doing something. And there are two things that we talked about in our session that I think are important that we actually do. One of them is we've got an awful lot of clean energy research going on in this area, and we have companies that are very involved in this, but it's hard to find them. You might find them in Utah, you might find them in Colorado, but a place to be able to find them all in one place would be tremendously advantageous. So perhaps the collaboratory might take the responsibility to collect that information from all of the universities and the various companies as well. So that's one thing, a resource to find each other. A second thing is, I know you're talking about having one-day workshops on some areas, and I think it is apropos for the universities in this region to each step up, like Utah would step up and do a one-day workshop, perhaps on energy and water, to start bringing the technical people together, not just the VPRs. So I think those are two things that we ought to do because of this workshop.
Thank you for that.
Anyone else? I know we're standing between you and a drink and some appetizers. Anyone?
Well, good. I mentioned brief, and we accomplished that goal. Thank you very much for your participation today, and please join us at the reception for some more discussion. And as was said, there will be follow-up action, and we look forward to working with you on that and seeing a successful mission innovation. Thank you very much.